The traffic light at the busy Chicago intersection had been red for 20 seconds, but Alexander Vance did not even notice. His eyes were glued to the screen of his phone, where the financial closing numbers of Vance Construction shone in bright green for the fourth consecutive quarter. It was the kind of immense corporate success that other men only dreamed of achieving in their lifetimes. It was the kind of success that he had completely stopped feeling a long time ago. The gentle tap on his tinted window was what finally tore him away from that sterile digital silence. He slowly looked up, fully prepared to ignore whatever or whoever was outside, but what he saw left him with his finger hovering over the screen, unable to press anything. She was standing right at the edge of the cold concrete sidewalk, clutching a small glass jar filled with handmade coconut candies to her chest, as if it were the most valuable possession she had in the entire world. And perhaps in that exact moment, it truly was. She was wearing her standard cleaning uniform, the very same one he had absently seen every single morning for months in the long polished hallways of his corporate building. And she was smiling at the waiting drivers with a profound dignity that did not ask for pity. It asked only for a fair opportunity. It was Lily, the cleaning employee from his headquarters. Alexander slowly rolled down his window, moving as if the simple gesture required significantly more time and effort than usual. Lily saw his face, and her polite smile instantly froze. It was not out of fear, but out of a deep, burning shame. It was the specific kind of shame that only genuinely good people feel when they are caught doing something that the unforgiving world might easily misinterpret. Her voice did not tremble when she spoke, but her worn hands gripped the glass jar just a little bit tighter against her coat. She told him that they were homemade coconut candies made entirely by her own hands, and if he was not interested, there was absolutely no problem. She was not asking for his permission to be there. She was simply informing him of her wares, and something in that subtle difference struck Alexander directly in the center of his chest. The traffic light abruptly turned green. The impatient cars behind him immediately started blaring their horns, echoing through the busy Chicago avenue. But Alexander did not move an inch. He firmly asked her how much the candies cost, causing Lily to blink in genuine surprise before answering that the entire jar containing exactly 6 pieces was $20. He smoothly pulled a crisp bill from his wallet and extended it through the open window. She carefully handed over the glass jar, using exactly the 2 hands that her unwavering pride demanded she use for such a transaction. The surrounding cars continued to honk aggressively. Alexander finally drove off, but he could not stop staring at her lingering reflection in his rearview mirror. Lily Rogers had been working diligently at the Vance Tower, the towering architectural marvel that served as the corporate headquarters of Vance Construction in downtown Chicago, for well over 1 year. She always arrived long before any other employee stepped foot in the lobby and left, when the vast majority of the staff were already safely at home eating dinner or resting by their televisions. She scrubbed the luxurious bathrooms of the executive floor with the exact same meticulous care that she applied to the muddy entrance hallways. She never made any distinction between the grand spaces that everyone admired and the hidden corners that nobody ever noticed. Nobody in the massive company knew much about her personal life. She greeted everyone with quiet courtesy, worked without ever being a hindrance, and vanished as if she had never been there at all. She was precisely the type of invisible person that a hyper-accelerated modern world quickly learns not to see. But if anyone had ever taken the time to truly look at her, they would have seen exactly what Alexander began to see that chilling afternoon from his rearview mirror. She was a solitary woman, carrying a burden far too heavy for her fragile shoulders. Yet she completely refused to bend under its crushing weight. What nobody in the corporate office knew, and what Lily had strictly kept to herself, Because pride is sometimes the only warm coat a poor person has left to wear against the cold was that her 12-year-old son, Thomas, had been on a torturous waiting list for weeks for a crucial spinal surgery. It was an absolutely essential medical intervention that could not be postponed much longer without permanent devastating consequences that the specialist doctors pronounced with the exact same cold, detached tone one uses to discuss the morning weather forecast. Her basic employee health insurance covered the standard checkups, but this complex surgery was entirely out of network. Lily had frantically done the math dozens of times on the rattling city bus heading home in the cramped kitchen of her tiny apartment, while her beloved Thomas slept peacefully, and in the empty hallways of the office building, while the freshly mopped floors still smelled of pine cleaner. The numbers always stubbornly equaled impossible, until she suddenly remembered her late grandmother's cherished recipes. She remembered the sweet coconut candies, the tamarind balls, and the homemade marzipan that she had grown up watching her grandmother make and sell at the local neighborhood fairs, slowly filling a battered metal tin with the hard-earned dollars from every little bag. Her grandmother had always wisely told her that dignity is never begged for. It is earned through honest labor. Thus, Lily began to tirelessly make candies every single night. After returning from her exhausting shift with aching feet and a tense spine, she would ignite the stove, melt the brown sugar, and lay the sweets out to dry on brown parchment paper. The next day, she would pack them into her grandmother's vintage glass jar, and as soon as her cleaning shift ended, she would stand at the main avenue's intersection just 2 blocks away from the massive skyscraper where she swept the floors for the most powerful man in the entire company. Alexander entered his luxurious penthouse apartment that evening without bothering to turn on the lights. He silently left the glass jar of sweets on the vast island of his modern kitchen and poured himself a tall glass of cold water. He drank very slowly, staring intently at the glass container without truly seeing it. He simply could not erase the haunting image of Lily standing at that windy intersection from his mind. It was not because he found it particularly strange that a person would desperately need extra money. He had spent years signing multi-million-dollar construction contracts and knew perfectly well that the city of Chicago was overflowing with struggling people who desperately needed much more than they currently had. What he absolutely could not shake off was something entirely different and profoundly unsettling. It was the striking way she had held that simple glass jar with both of her hands standing perfectly tall and erect, completely refusing to apologize for her humble presence on that harsh street corner. He found himself deeply wondering when was the last time he had ever held on to anything with that level of genuine conviction and raw pride. Alexander Vance seemingly possessed everything that modern society dictates should define absolute success. He owned a massive empire that built sprawling hospitals, high-end shopping centers, and massive residential complexes across 4 different states. He lived in a stunning 22nd-floor penthouse that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city skyline. He had built a formidable reputation that miraculously opened heavy doors long before he even had to knock. And yet, despite all of this overwhelming abundance, there was a deeply hidden void inside his life that had felt agonizingly hollow for many long months, much like an abandoned construction project boasting a pristine, perfect facade, but an entirely unfinished, empty interior. His late father, a hard-working man who had humbly started with a tiny neighborhood hardware store and had eventually turned their family name into a respected synonym for honest, grueling labor, had told him something shortly before passing away. It was a profound piece of advice that Alexander had conveniently archived in a dusty corner of his mind that he rarely visited anymore. His father had gently warned him that the money that costs you nothing absolutely teaches you nothing, and urged his son to constantly beware of the hollow victories that arrive far too easily. At that specific moment in time, a much younger Alexander had simply dismissed the warning as the sentimental nostalgia of an old, tired man. However, now, as a 42-year-old executive standing in the dim light with a cheap glass jar of coconut candies resting on his imported Italian marble countertop, he was finally beginning to severely suspect that his late father had been infinitely wiser than he had ever wanted to admit. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the towering office building exactly 40 minutes earlier than his usual scheduled time. This early arrival was certainly not something he normally did. His dedicated executive assistant Robert, a highly efficient young man who managed the CEO's hectic life with the flawless precision of an imported luxury watch, was always genuinely shocked whenever his boss appeared anywhere before 9 in the morning. That particular morning, instead of heading to his spacious top-floor suite, Alexander walked directly to the Human Resources Department. He stood in the doorway of the small office where Fiona Turner, the experienced head of personnel, was already diligently reviewing endless emails with a steaming cup of dark coffee resting right next to her computer keyboard. He firmly asked her to immediately pull the complete employment file of Lily Rogers from the building maintenance area. Fiona slowly looked up from her bright monitor, her face displaying undeniable surprise. In over 1 year of working together, she had never once heard Mr. Vance specifically ask for any member of the nighttime cleaning crew by their actual first name. She cautiously asked if there was a problem, to which he simply replied that he only needed routine information. Lily's file was incredibly brief, but highly revealing. It documented 1 year and 3 months of flawless service without a single unexcused absence, not a single tardy arrival, and absolutely zero registered complaints. Her quarterly performance evaluations consistently featured the highest possible scores across the entire maintenance department. There was also a small handwritten margin note left by Grace, her previous strict supervisor. The note explicitly stated that Lily was an exceptional worker who always arrived earlier than required and left later than anyone else, noting that without her relentless dedication, the massive glass building would never shine the way it did. Alexander carefully read that specific sentence twice. Then his eyes naturally drifted down to the section he had been dreading to find her current compensation level. A sharp, painful knot instantly tightened deep inside his stomach when he saw the numbers. She was earning the absolute legal minimum wage. The only addition was a pathetically small punctuality bonus that she had managed to earn perfectly for 12 consecutive months, without failing even once. He closed the manila folder and handed it back to Fiona without uttering another word. He rode the silent elevator all the way up to his sprawling office, with the overwhelming sensation that something incredibly important had just begun to shift deep inside his soul, even though he still did not quite know in what direction it was taking him. That very same afternoon, Lily was quietly finishing mopping the long corridor of the 30th floor when she clearly heard her name called out. She turned around to see Mr. Vance standing right next to the heavy glass doors of the main executive boardroom, with both of his hands casually tucked into his expensive pockets, and a soft expression that certainly did not belong to a ruthless man who regularly signed multi-million-dollar contracts without blinking. He politely asked if she had a moment to spare. Lily carefully leaned her damp mop against the wall, nodded respectfully, and followed him inside. He gently closed the heavy door behind them, instantly cutting off the busy hum of the corporate office. Lily remained standing perfectly still, right next to the nearest leather chair, completely refusing to sit down, because absolutely nobody had told her she was allowed to do so. In her harsh reality, people like her learned extremely quickly never to take up more physical space than what was strictly granted to them by those in power. Alexander warmly asked her to please take a seat, and there was something noticeably different in the tone of his voice. It lacked the automatic, cold authority of a distant boss, and sounded much more like the quiet discomfort of a man struggling to find the right words. She cautiously perched herself on the very edge of the chair, keeping her spine rigid, and her hands neatly folded in her lap. He looked at her, and plainly stated that he had seen her at the avenue intersection the previous afternoon. A heavy silence filled the large room. Lily did not utter a single word in response. She completely refused to offer any apologies, she provided absolutely no frantic explanations, and she certainly did not lower her proud gaze. She simply looked directly into his eyes and finally replied that she was already aware of that fact. He then asked her a very direct, unadorned question about why she felt the need to sell homemade candies on the freezing streets after finishing an exhausting cleaning shift. Lily received the blunt question with the exact same level of straightforward honesty. She simply stated that she sold them because she desperately needed the extra funds. When he gently inquired if she required more money for basic living expenses, she paused to consider the question for a long second before explaining that her young son desperately needed a crucial spinal operation. She clarified that while it was not an immediate life-or-death emergency for that exact day, it was definitely a deteriorating condition that could not wait forever. She calmly explained that her current employee insurance plan fell drastically short of covering the total procedure, so she was tirelessly working every single night to gather the remaining financial difference on her own. Alexander observed her with that specific frustrated expression that powerful men often adopt whenever a complex situation unexpectedly slips completely out of their tight control. What he felt in his chest was not a fleeting sense of pity. It was something far closer to a profound, long-overdue recognition of genuine human resilience. When he asked exactly how much money was still missing from her goal, Lily maintained her impenetrable composure. She firmly told him that the remaining balance was a private matter strictly between her and her brave son. Her calm response was not an act of rudeness. It was a strong, protective boundary that she had absolutely every right in the world to firmly draw around her small family. Alexander slowly nodded his head in complete understanding and made absolutely no effort to press her any further on the sensitive topic. A comfortable silence settled between them, one that neither felt any urgent need to rush or break. Outside the thick glass windows, the massive city of Chicago continued to buzz loudly with its relentless daily rhythm, completely oblivious to the fact that inside this quiet room something invisible was fundamentally shifting its weight. Finally, Alexander broke the silence by softly remarking that the coconut candies he bought were genuinely delicious. For the very first time since stepping into that intimidating executive boardroom, Lily allowed a tiny, proud smile to briefly touch the corners of her tired lips, simply noting that it was her beloved grandmother's special recipe. He sincerely agreed that the rich quality of the recipe was incredibly evident. Lily gracefully stood up from the edge of the leather chair, calmly retrieved her cleaning mop from the hallway, and walked away with her back perfectly straight, never once asking for permission to occupy the space she rightfully deserved in the world. Alexander remained completely alone in that massive boardroom where countless ruthless decisions involving millions of dollars had been coldly negotiated over the years. Yet, for the first time in a very long while, the pressing decision occupying his restless mind had absolutely nothing to do with profit margins, quarterly yields, or greedy shareholders. It had everything to do with deeply questioning what kind of blind man he had become to ignore the harsh struggles happening just a few steps away from his own office door. Lily firmly believed her grandmother's wisdom that dignity is never begged for, but rather built through hard work, and she lived by that truth every day. What Alexander did not yet fully grasp, and what he would soon slowly discover, was the terrifying extent of the medical battle she was silently fighting alone. Her brave 12-year-old son Thomas possessed a radiant smile that could effortlessly illuminate the darkest room in their tiny apartment. However, he also carried a devastating medical diagnosis that had arrived without any warning whatsoever. What had initially started as a seemingly harmless, persistent backache had rapidly escalated into a terrifying sequence of 3 detailed X-rays, 2 complex MRI scans, and an incredibly heavy conversation with a somber specialist. The stern doctor had carefully chosen his words when diagnosing the severe progressive scoliosis that absolutely required a complex surgical intervention to prevent permanent damage. Lily had absorbed the terrifying medical terms while sitting right next to Thomas, desperately gripping his small hand in hers. She had done exactly what fierce mothers invariably do when they simply cannot afford the luxury of collapsing in front of their frightened children. She had taken a deep breath, nodded firmly at the grim doctor, and immediately asked about the necessary next steps. As they exited the sterile clinic, Thomas had looked up at her with large, innocent eyes and bravely promised her that he was going to be perfectly fine, unknowingly becoming the one comforting his own mother in their darkest hour. That fateful night, after Thomas finally drifted off to sleep, Lily quietly wept for several long minutes in her cramped kitchen, leaving the rusty faucet running at full blast, so the loud rush of water would completely mask the sounds of her breaking heart. Once the tears finally stopped, she splashed her exhausted face with freezing water, brewed a weak cup of herbal tea, and pulled out her battered notebook to meticulously calculate the terrifying hospital expenses. There was absolutely no room in her life for paralyzing despair. Her son desperately needed this operation, and every other obstacle was merely a temporary puzzle waiting for her to solve. Days after their brief encounter in the boardroom, Alexander Vance executed a corporate maneuver that nobody in the entire company could have ever anticipated. He abruptly summoned a high-level, closed-door meeting with Fiona Turner from Human Resources and Mitchell, the seasoned operations director. Mitchell was a gray-haired veteran who had dedicated 17 long years to the construction firm and prided himself on his uncanny ability to accurately predict the CEO's every strategic move. When Alexander stepped into the private room and firmly shut the door, Mitchell casually crossed his arms across his chest and waited patiently. Fiona silently opened her detailed personnel folders, waiting for instructions. Alexander did not waste any time with pleasantries. He immediately demanded a complete, comprehensive review of the entire salary structure for every single member of the operational staff, making it explicitly clear that he wanted the analysis to include the cleaners, the guards, and the maintenance crew. Fiona raised her eyebrows in mild shock and cautiously asked if there was a specific troubling incident that had suddenly triggered this massive, unbudgeted review. Alexander shortly replied that there was indeed a reason, but he completely refused to elaborate any further on the matter. Mitchell observed his boss with that calculating sideways glance unique to veteran executives who have witnessed far too many corporate crises to be easily rattled, yet possess enough sharp intuition to recognize when a monumental shift is occurring. Mitchell calmly reminded Alexander that their current wage scales were perfectly aligned with the standard market parameters and that the massive company was strictly complying with absolutely everything that the labor laws legally demanded of them. Alexander looked his old director dead in the eye and coldly stated that merely complying with the bare minimum of the law was absolutely not the same thing as actually doing what was morally right. A heavy, stunned silence instantly blanketed the room. In all his 17 years of loyal service, Mitchell had never once heard the famously pragmatic CEO utter a sentence driven by sheer morality rather than pure profit. When Fiona cautiously pressed him on what exactly he had in mind for the new budget, Alexander honestly admitted that he did not possess all the specific details just yet. However, he firmly commanded them to place the revised, substantially higher financial projections on his desk by the following week. Furthermore, he demanded to know if the multi-state corporation had any existing internal support programs designed to financially assist dedicated employees facing severe medical emergencies within their immediate families. When Fiona hesitantly confirmed that absolutely no such compassionate program existed in their corporate structure, Alexander curtly nodded, as if this disappointing answer merely confirmed a grim suspicion he already harbored. He decisively ordered her to begin drafting the necessary paperwork to immediately establish one. The intense meeting concluded just 20 minutes later. As Mitchell and Fiona quietly stepped out into the brightly lit executive hallway, they exchanged a very long, meaningful look. Neither spoke a single word, but they both shared the exact same thought: something fundamental had changed inside Mr. Vance. That very same evening, as Alexander walked out of the towering skyscraper, he deliberately chose the much longer walking route toward the executive parking garage. The traffic light at the corner was glowing a bright, solid red. Lily was already standing at her usual post, clutching her heavy glass jar. When he rolled down his tinted window this time, she looked at him without a trace of surprise, almost as if she had been quietly expecting his arrival. She politely offered him another jar of her homemade treats. He surprised her by requesting 2 full jars instead of just one. She handed the heavy glass containers over with her trademark serene calmness, carefully accepting his cash with both of her tired hands, as her pride always dictated. However, just before the traffic light finally shifted to green, Alexander casually mentioned something that caught Lily completely off guard. He casually suggested that she should consider selling her delicious candies inside the massive office building directly to the hundreds of busy corporate employees. Lily looked at him, her sharp mind instantly calculating the potential risks of such a bold move. She honestly replied that she had never even attempted to do so because she was entirely unsure if such informal commerce was strictly permitted by the building management. Alexander looked her directly in the eyes and firmly assured her with the full authority of the CEO that it was indeed fully permitted from that day forward. The traffic light abruptly changed, and his expensive luxury car smoothly merged into the heavy Chicago traffic. Lily remained standing absolutely still on the freezing sidewalk, holding the newly emptied glass jar in her hands. A strange, unfamiliar sensation began to slowly bloom inside her weary chest, a feeling she did not yet know exactly how to properly name. It was definitely not full-blown hope. Her harsh life had taught her that it was far too early to blindly trust in something as fragile as hope. It was something much smaller and infinitely more delicate. It felt exactly like a heavy rusted door that had been locked tightly for years, suddenly cracking open just an inch, allowing a tiny warm thread of golden light to finally pierce through the suffocating darkness. The Vance Tower was a magnificent, imposing structure made entirely of gleaming steel and reflective glass, rising 30 floors into the cloudy sky. It proudly housed over 142 registered corporate employees and featured a chic modern cafeteria in the grand lobby that sold fancy lattes at outrageous prices that absolutely no hard-working member of the nighttime maintenance crew could ever reasonably afford. Lily had known this brutal economic reality since her very first day on the job. What she absolutely did not know, however, was the incredible chain of events that would rapidly unfold the very next morning after the powerful CEO had looked her in the eyes and spoken those 2 magical words giving her official permission. She arrived for her grueling morning shift, carrying the heavy glass jar of sweets, carefully wrapped in a simple cloth bag, safely tucked away inside her worn backpack just as she always did. Absolutely nothing had visibly changed in her strict daily routine. She caught the exact same early bus, entered through the exact same hidden service door, and began her demanding chores. Yet the atmosphere inside the building felt distinctly different. Similar to the electric tension in the sky, right before a massive summer thunderstorm finally breaks. She methodically cleaned the restrooms on the second floor, then moved to the long corridors of the third. When she finally reached the busy fourth-floor home to the creative architectural design team, a young architect named Daisy warmly flagged her down. Daisy, a genuinely kind woman who had always treated the cleaning staff with profound respect, eagerly asked Lily if she was still making those famous coconut candies she had heard rumors about, completely ready to purchase some. Lily paused, her heart beating slightly faster, and slowly pulled the beautiful glass jar from her bag. She quietly stated the price of $20 per jar. Daisy excitedly handed over a crisp bill without a single second of hesitation. Before her long cleaning shift even reached its halfway point, Lily had successfully sold 4 entire jars to various eager employees. The very next day, that number proudly grew to 6. By the end of the week, busy professionals were actually waiting for her in the hallways just to buy her treats. Meanwhile, completely hidden from Lily's view on the 30th floor, Alexander had arrived at his luxurious office exactly at 8 in the morning with a startling punctuality that continuously bewildered Robert. The old version of the CEO usually rushed in late, constantly barking orders into his phone, his chaotic mind always focused on a dozen different crises at once. This new calmer Alexander simply sat quietly at his massive desk, deeply lost in thought. Resting directly in front of him was the comprehensive financial report he had aggressively demanded from Fiona. It contained the complete detailed salary structure for the entire operational staff. He silently read the names of 43 hardworking people, the loyal doormen, the tireless cleaning crew, the internal messengers, and the skilled maintenance technicians. He methodically read through all 43 dismal compensation figures, completely uninterrupted by phone calls or emails. When he finally finished the depressing task, he slowly closed the thick folder and stood up to stare out the vast window. The sprawling city of Chicago stretched out infinitely beneath him like a giant complex map of other people's forgotten decisions. He stared at the glittering glass towers built by exhausted hands that were never allowed to cross their grand lobbies. He saw the smoothly paved avenues constructed by manual laborers who could never afford to own a car to drive on them. Robert timidly knocked on the heavy wooden door to remind him of a crucial board meeting at 9 in the morning, but Alexander simply ordered him to cancel it immediately. Robert blinked in profound confusion, unsure if he had heard his boss correctly, and asked if he should merely reschedule it. Alexander firmly repeated his command and told him to send Fiona in within 10 minutes. When Fiona entered the expansive office, she found the CEO standing perfectly still by the large window, clutching the salary folder. He wore a serious, determined expression that she had never witnessed in all her years of loyal service. He decisively ordered her to immediately implement a massive, staggered salary increase for every single member of the operational staff, starting directly with the lowest-paid workers at the very bottom of the corporate ladder, demanding the project be finalized before the month concluded. Fiona anxiously opened her notebook, warning him that such a drastic, unbudgeted financial move would severely impact the quarterly profit margins, and that the greedy shareholders would undoubtedly demand harsh answers. Alexander calmly replied that they could ask whatever they wanted, and he would personally shoulder the full responsibility of answering them. When Fiona carefully asked what exact motivation had sparked this massive, unprecedented shift in corporate policy, Alexander simply looked at her and softly replied that it was entirely due to a cheap glass jar of coconut candies. He refused to offer any further explanation. That very same evening, Lily arrived back at her tiny apartment with exhausted feet, but a wonderfully light backpack, having completely sold out her entire inventory long before 4 in the afternoon. She meticulously counted the large pile of crumpled bills on her small kitchen table, with the intense laser-like focus of a master architect reviewing complex structural blueprints. Her son Thomas sat directly across from her, diligently working on his difficult school assignments under the weak glow of a tilted desk lamp. He casually asked her how her day had gone, without looking up from his thick textbook. Lily proudly smiled, her heart swelling with an unfamiliar joy, and told him that she had managed to sell absolutely everything. Thomas finally looked up, flashing a massive, beautiful smile that perfectly mirrored his late father's joyful expression, and quietly asked how much more money they needed to save before they could finally afford his desperately needed surgery. Lily hesitated for a fleeting moment. Thomas had deliberately stopped asking that painful question for many long months, perhaps, because he had bravely learned to stop hoping to protect his own fragile heart. She honestly told him that they still needed more, but the terrifying gap was finally closing much faster than she had ever dreamed. Days later, a frantic phone call from the medical clinic shattered their quiet evening routine. A sudden, unexpected cancellation meant there was an open slot in the surgical schedule, but they only had 48 hours to secure the deposit and confirm the appointment. The immense pressure threatened to crush Lily's spirit, but she refused to surrender. Fortunately, the incredibly kind architect Daisy discovered the urgent dilemma and immediately formulated a brilliant modern plan. Daisy asked for Lily's strict permission to record a short, entirely respectful video of her preparing the famous grandmother's recipe in her humble kitchen. Lily firmly agreed, under the strict condition that there would be absolutely no mention of the surgery or any attempt to solicit pity from strangers. The short, beautiful video beautifully captured Lily's hard-working hands meticulously rolling the sweet dough, while she softly explained her grandmother's wise philosophy that a tiny pinch of salt was the absolute secret to making the sweet flavors truly sing. Within mere hours, the authentic, heartwarming video amassed 8,000 organic views across the internet. An overwhelming flood of massive candy orders poured in from every single floor of the towering corporate building, and even from distant neighborhoods across the city. The spectacular viral success brought in a massive wave of unexpected cash, significantly shrinking the daunting medical debt. However, the true miracle occurred back at the corporate office, when Fiona Turner suddenly summoned Lily into a quiet, private meeting room. Fiona nervously slid a formal, heavily stamped document across the smooth table. It was an extraordinary medical coverage extension form, a completely forgotten, dusty clause hidden deep within the old collective bargaining agreement that legally allowed the massive company to fully cover catastrophic surgical costs for the dependents of loyal employees who had served continuously for over 12 months. Fiona softly explained that the CEO himself had personally hunted down the obscure clause, thoroughly reviewed her flawless file, and officially approved the massive expense. Lily stared blindly at Alexander Vance's bold signature at the very bottom of the page, completely overwhelmed by a sudden crashing wave of pure relief. She calmly signed the necessary acceptance, papers, walked slowly out of the room, stepped inside the empty 25th floor bathroom, and finally allowed herself to break down and weep uncontrollably for 3 full minutes. The crushing weight of the impossible world had finally been lifted from her tired shoulders. The intricate surgery took place 2 days later. The tense procedure lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, during which Lily sat frozen in the sterile waiting room, clutching her blank notebook like a desperate lifeline. The exhausted surgeon finally emerged smiling warmly and declared the complex spinal correction an absolute resounding success. During the grueling hours of the surgery, Alexander deliberately chose to visit a dusty, chaotic construction site on the far outskirts of the city instead of sitting in his plush office. He desperately wanted to truly see the invisible hands that built his massive empire. He struck up a genuine conversation with a young nervous worker named Riley, asking about his family and his daily struggles. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, an incredibly kind nurse named Beatrice gently helped a groggy Thomas wake up from the heavy anesthesia, assuring the frightened boy that his brave mother was waiting right outside. Back at the corporate office, a young intern named Marcus helped Daisy collect a thick envelope filled with spontaneous, heartfelt donations from dozens of inspired co-workers. When Lily triumphantly returned to her cleaning duties the following week, holding her head higher than ever before, Alexander was patiently waiting for her in the sunlit hallway. She looked the powerful CEO directly in the eyes and offered him her deepest, most profound gratitude for finally choosing to see the invisible people who quietly held his massive world together. Alexander humbly smiled back, softly admitting that her unwavering pride and her grandmother's simple glass jar of sweets had completely reminded him of the honorable man his late father had always desperately wanted him to become. The quiet interaction firmly sealed a profound, unspoken mutual respect between two completely different worlds that had finally learned to understand and value one another. Later that evening, Alexander sat down at his kitchen table and completely surprised his teenage children, Sebastian and Valerie, by awkwardly cooking them a simple meal of scrambled eggs. As they ate together, he opened his heart and shared the entire beautiful story of the proud woman and the jar of coconut candies, passionately teaching them that true wealth is never measured by massive bank accounts, but rather by how deeply you respect and uplift the hard-working people around you. Back in their tiny, warm apartment, Thomas proudly managed to walk exactly 8 unassisted steps across the living room, a monumental victory that filled the small space with immeasurable joy. Lily carefully placed a freshly filled jar of sweets on the counter, knowing her future was finally secure. In the end, the most profound victories in our lives are rarely announced with loud fanfare or grand sweeping gestures. They are quietly forged in the crucible of daily perseverance, in the simple, unwavering dignity of doing honest work with our own 2 hands, regardless of who is watching. The profound journey of a mother refusing to bend under the crushing weight of an indifferent world teaches us that true strength does not lie in wealth or status, but in the fierce, unyielding love we hold for our families. It reminds us that every person, no matter how seemingly invisible their daily labor might appear, carries a heavy universe of struggles and dreams within them. When we finally choose to open our eyes and extend a hand not out of fleeting pity, but out of genuine human respect, we not only change their harsh reality, but we fundamentally heal the